So welcome back to everyone. If you were here with us last week, if you weren't and you're just joining us for this class, welcome. We had a really fun time last class talking about kind of the history of nature journaling, what it means to go out in nature and make observations, and why this is beneficial, not only to our health, but also just kind of in reinforcing that sense of place that we have here in our local community. And so the goal for today's class is to focus specifically on some terminology and some identifying characteristics of plants that might be useful to you as you start to document and make observations in your nature journaling journey. And so we're going to talk about here. We're going to describe plants. So we're going to talk about kind of their general forms, their growth habits, leaf shape, and ways to describe leaf shape. And we're going to talk just kind of an overview on flower anatomy. And I'll talk a little bit too there about kind of like seed dispersal and some things about how plants kind of get their genetic information spread around. We're going to talk a little bit about botanical names and where different species tend to be found. And then we're going to have some practice activities throughout. And just like we did last week, we have a Jamboard that we're going to be using. And I'll put that link in the chat here in just a minute when we get to that point so that we can all access that. It has images, and I'm going to ask you to participate there. So I'm going to try. Eileen, I'm going to make you a co-host, and if you can try to figure out who these people are that are in the waiting room that all have your name, but one of them has a picture that is not you. So, and we had somebody else who came in and they had your name, but they did not, but I had to change their name. So I'm going to go ahead and...
That might be the people that registered. Well, they should have put their own name though, because I sent out the link for them to register. So I wonder how they do that. So yep, I'll have to rename them as they come in.
Okay, I just went ahead and made you a co-host. So if you could do that while I'm moving forward, that would be helpful. Thank you. All right, so again, we're gonna, this is kind of our agenda for today's class. You know, last class, we had roughly the same number of kind of activities and slides. So we'll see if we take the whole hour or not, but we had some really good discussions last time. So I'm looking forward to it. Does anybody have any observations or takeaways that they have from our last class that they'd like to share now at the beginning before we get started?
I was inspired to pull out all the pieces of things that I've written over the years. And I've got a giant pile of, and from the Master Gardener conferences, I pulled out those things, and they're all on my dining room table. And I'm truly inspired to go through them and try to make some semblance of order out of them.
Awesome. That's great. So somebody feeling inspired, and that's great. And you have a lot of resources, Patsy. So it'll be neat to see what you kind of figure out and how you organize that that information that you have. Does anybody else have any other kind of insights or takeaways or revelations? If not, that's okay. No pressure. Go ahead and move on. All right. So as we get started with today's topic, I wanted to start off, if we could, just with what is a plant. And, you know, for the folks in this group, we're a wide variety of individuals. You know, there's a couple Master Gardener volunteers that are in here, so some of this information is going to be probably really repetitive, or you've heard it before. But for those folks who don't engage that often with botanical terminology, or are, you know, of the group of people who just generally fall into the it's green, it's a plant kind of kind of a segment of the population, you know, this will help you to kind of start to categorize and learn how to classify and organize your thoughts about what you're seeing when you're looking at plants. And so when we think about what a plant is, I want to hear from you all. This stuff is, you know, this is the biological terminology. This is how scientists define a plant. But I want to hear from you, and you can go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself. What do you think of as a plant?
I think of a plant as something that sustains off of the sun and water.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. Sun and water are necessary for plants to survive. Do we tend to think of plants as, that's kind of a leading question. Where would you put plants on kind of the biological hierarchy of organisms? Do you think that they're really important, or not as important, or not important at all?
I say essential.
I see Nancy nodding her head up and down. Yeah. Yep. So plants often fall into this category of organisms that we call primary producers, which means that they are the kind of first step in taking the energy from the sun and converting it into consumable energy for the rest of the life forms on the planet, right? So without plants, at least in our biosphere, right, here on planet Earth, right, we rely on that solar energy, which is converted to sugars and starches by plants, which are then consumed by other organisms, which are then consumed by other organisms, on and on, etc. And this happens in the aquatic environments as well. So plants really are kind of the essential factory that transforms the energy from the sun into something that is usable for the rest of us here on the planet. And you know, these words that I have here on the slide, you know, eukaryotic, going back to like your middle school, you know, science class, who remembers what a eukaryote is? Anybody? It just means multicellular. It's a eukaryotic organism, meaning it has multiple cells that form up its body, right? A bacteria or a virus, these things are not eukaryotic. They have one cell. That's all they are. That's all they do. So plants are eukaryotic, meaning they're made up of many cells and cells that have different jobs, and they're photosynthetic. Generally, there are a few exceptions to the photosynthetic rule, but they are so limited in their scope that we consider plants to be any kind of eukaryotic photosynthetic organism. Now, there happens to be a sea slug that has figured out how to consume algae and then use the photosynthetic cells from the algae to actually create its own food. So there is a sea slug that is photosynthetic, but it's not a plant. Because another subcategory of how to define what a plant is that it's non-animal or non-fungal. Up until maybe, I don't know, I'm gonna get the time frame wrong, but up until the last century, plants and fungi, fungal organisms, were part of the same group, right? People treated mushrooms and plants in a similar fashion. But we've figured out that no, absolutely that's not the case. Fungi are actually much more closely related to us than they are to plants. So we kind of take them out of the plant category. So it's non-animal, non-fungal, multicellular organisms that can perform photosynthesis. Something that also makes them unique are these rigid cell walls that they have. And this allows them to get that kind of structure that they need to get up off the ground and grow up, right? Think about something like, you know, next week we're going to talk more specifically about trees, but redwoods, right? That's an incredibly huge organism that has to be able to support an immense weight going really high up into the air. So they have to have these rigid cell walls that build on top of each other to provide that structure. And they also have no nervous system. So that means that, you know, as we understand kind of the way that we engage with touch and hearing and our 5 senses, right? The way that we engage with that kind of stuff is through our nervous system. Plants don't have that. So there are a lot of assumptions about kind of how plants engage with their environment. We're finding out a lot more about chemical signaling between plants and how plants can communicate with each other and within broad communities, and they support each other through fungal networks and all kinds of really interesting things that prove to us that plants are actually whole communities rather than just a single organism. But for the most part, right, we can ascribe no consciousness to a plant. You can read some really interesting research on plants that were subjected to different kinds of music or people yelling at them. Like there was some grad student somewhere got paid to yell at a plant to like, you're a bad plant. and how those plants didn't grow as well or as vigorously as plants that had been told like, you're such a good plant, you're such a wonderful plant, you know. So there's some interesting kind of fringe research out there on things like that. But for the most part, right, plants have no consciousness, they have no nervous system. So that's what a plant is. Now we separate plants into many different groups according to a process called binomial nomenclature or phylogeny. You know, it's essentially just the kingdom of life, right? The tree of life. And we've all seen how that plays out, right? You have kingdoms, phyla, and then you get all the way down to your families, genus, species. And that's where you kind of suss out these different characteristics that the plants have, and then they are grouped into these different categories. A lot of these classifications have been changing recently due to changes in how we are looking at the genetic information that we find in plants, and we can find them kind of more closely related to certain species based on their genetic information rather than just looking at their physical or morphological traits. And when I say morphological, what does that word mean? Does anybody remember what that one means? I know that there's a lot of vocabulary in here, but I'm trying to, the purpose of today is to give us the language we need to kind of better make observations, right? And so the morphological traits of an organism are going to be just like how it looks, right? How does it look? Is it dark green, light green, fuzzy, lanky, long and viney, short and shrubby, woody, right? Those are morphological traits. And if you think about that from a genetic perspective, right, that is your phenotype, not your genotype. So your genotype is what your genes actually say, and your phenotype is how you express those genes, right? So the morphological traits of our plants are those things that we can kind of see and describe. So when we're working in our nature journals and we're writing down these observations, we're relying on those morphological traits. And so as you get more comfortable with looking at plants and identifying plants, you may say, that looks like an aster of some kind, and you could write yourself a little note in your nature journal based on the, characteristics that I'm seeing here, the number of petals, the shape of the flower. I think that this is in the aster family. And then that will help you when you go back and try to identify it later if that's one of your goals. Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to do an activity break because I think it's important for us to break this up as much as we can. And I'm going to head to the Jamboard, and let me go ahead and put the link in the chat for you. There you go. So everybody should be able to see that Jamboard link. Go ahead and click on it. And when you click on it, I see a couple people have already joined us. So I would like you to please use the drawing tool here, the little pen, and just draw some arrows pointing to pictures of plants. What things are plants? Find the plants in these 3 images.
Oh, wow.
And if you weren't here last week and you're unfamiliar with Jamboard, the left-hand side is where you'll find all of the tools that you can use. And the top one is a pen.
I'm not seeing the little drawing tools on mine. It says that I can only view,
Okay.
and I have to ask you for access. So I wonder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me change the your guys's. You guys were all in front of my link box here.
The tricky part about all the online things, they always throw things like behind the Zoom, and you're like,
right.
Well, how am I supposed to find it?
Okay. Here you go. That should do you. Good. Seeing a lot of you all drawing. Good. Great. Don't know if anybody has missed anything so far. It looks good. So all 3 of these pictures are pictures that I took. The one on the left is at Myakka River State Park. There was a burn there and it hollowed out this tree, and there was this polypody fern growing out from inside of a burned tree. The one in the middle, can anybody guess where that is?
Selby.
Yep, that's at Marie Selby. My daughter, every time we go to Marie Selby, she always is like dragging me through the orchid house. Mom, stop taking pictures. And then the one on the right is actually along the Pinellas Trail, the bike trail up in Pinellas County. And correctly, folks have not indicated the jack-o'-lantern mushroom that's there, which is called the jack-o'-lantern because they glow in the dark.
Wow.
So I actually crashed my bike trying to get a picture of this mushroom because I saw it out of the corner of my eye as I was biking past it. So very interesting mushroom, but not a plant, right? That's a fungus. But you have pointed to the moss on the tree, which is great, the tree itself. And the same goes for the photo on the far left from Myakka. You've pointed to the tree, you've pointed to the foliage and the brush. that are around the tree. So this is good, right? These are eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms. They're not fungi, and they're plants. And we can see in looking at these pictures that plants can take an incredible diversity of forms, right? They can have really big showy flowers. They can be epiphytic, which is a word to describe a plant that can grow outside of the soil or up in a tree, or another word would be like an air plant, right? So orchids are epiphytic, meaning you usually in nature would find them kind of, stuck in the crook of a tree somewhere. And ferns are really interesting, right? These are non-flowering. They don't produce seeds. They produce structures called spores, which are what allow them to reproduce. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we head back to the presentation here. Okay. So I want to go back quickly to here. And this image, when we talk about when we talk about the different groups of plants, right, we saw some really good examples there of the way plants can be incredibly diverse in just a short span of location. And so when we look here, I want to point out some of these categories like bryophytes. So we pointed to the moss on the tree. Moss falls into this classification of bryophytes. Mosses can only reproduce in the presence of water. There has to be some kind of water present in order for a moss to be able to reproduce. Pteridophytes are those are our ferns, and they also need water, but they can survive for long periods of time in dry areas. But these are the organisms, they're non-flowering, they're non-seed producing. These organisms use those spores in order to reproduce. And then you get into the other classifications, gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are mostly trees. That's going to be our pine trees and cedars, things like that. And then angiosperms are going to be the plants that are kind of what we typically think of like our flowering plants, our seed producing plants. That's the rest of them. And that I just wanted to kind of go back to this and give you that a little bit more detailed information on this graphic, which I think is stunning and really does a great job of showing like the wide diversity of plants that there are. So when we think about how to describe a plant, one of the things that I think is good for us to recognize is that plants, they don't look a certain way for no reason. They have a form specifically to perform some kind of function, right? Over the course of millennia, these plants have evolved to gain this specific form that they have, right? And so I've got a few pictures on here, ferns, right? Like low light conditions, they're typically in wetter areas, forest floor situations. These are our pteridophytes. They don't produce flowers, so they're going to rely on air dispersal of their spores or water dispersal of their spores in order to reproduce. So they're going to tend to be in areas that are going to allow them to do that. They have this really frilly, feathery appearance to their ferns because they produce the spores on the underside of each of these leaflets, and the spores are then kind of released. And so there has to be kind of this airy shape to them. They can't be very compact, because if the fern is very compact, it doesn't give anywhere for those spores to go. And then you have something like a cactus here, right? Cactus live in incredibly arid environments. They have to protect their water. And so they have spines to protect the water that's stored inside of their bodies, right? So this form that they have follows a function. And then, does anybody know what these are, the trees in the upper right? Yep. Baobabs. And these are really, really neat trees. They can live for hundreds of years. They also live in very arid environments, but they live in areas where leaves are like a prized possession, right, for the grazers that exist in this environment. And so they don't keep any branches where anything can reach the leaves, right? They want to keep it out of reach of all of those grazers. So they have these funny bodies that's basically like a big straw, and then their branches come out up towards the top. So can you think of any other plants that have a form related to its function?
Mangroves.
Mangoes?
Mangrove.
Oh, mangroves. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. If you're not familiar with mangrove trees, they are absolutely suited to their function and their location, right? They grow in the estuary systems, most often in standing water. They have prop roots to hold them up out of the water. And they have structures in their bodies that allow them to either exclude salt, so they close off the cells and don't allow any salt into their bodies, or they can extrude salt through pores in their leaves. Yeah, so their form absolutely follows their function and their place in the ecosystem. Anybody have any other thoughts?
Cypress trees.
Cypress trees are another good example. What about, let's see, does anybody, who in here kind of like goes out in the woods frequently in Florida? Anybody do that? Am I the only crazy one in the group?
I do.
So there's a vine around here called smilax.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So smilax is a vine, and so it's got that vining shape, but it also has a lot of thorns on it. And it's because its tender young leaves are super delectable, right? And so it wants to protect itself from getting eaten. So there's, there are different structures that plants will produce in order to protect themselves and to fit in a specific niche in the environment in which they're in. So there are different words that we use to describe form, vining, twining, sprawling, upright, herbaceous, prostrate, shrub-like. These are all words that we can use to describe the form a plant takes. What is, I want to ask you all, because some of these may be unfamiliar. What do you think of when you think of a plant that is sprawling? You don't have to describe not a specific plant, but just what would you think a sprawling plant would look like?
A vine.
Mm-hmm.
One that covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I even think of, if you're familiar with poinciana trees, they have these branches that really droop down and reach out. And I even kind of think of those in my head as kind of like sprawling branches, right? It means they're kind of taking up a lot of space. They're spreading themselves out. Star jasmine, it droops over, it sprawls its arms out in a big distance around itself. Upright, right? That's going to be a plant that doesn't have a lot of that sprawling nature. It's going to be more upright. Herbaceous usually means leafy. So a plant that is very leafy and usually with soft leaves, not like rigid leaves. So flexible leaves that's going to be an herbaceous plant. Something that's prostrate. Prostrate and sprawling could be used to describe the same plant, but prostrate specifically means that it goes along the surface of the soil. And so there are plants that are vines that do this, but then there are also plants like native porterweed that just kind of hug the surface of the soil and never get more than a couple inches tall. So prostrate is a word you could use, and then shrub-like, something that looks like a shrub. Can anybody think of any other words that they would use to describe the form of a plant? It really could be any adjective, right?
Stiff. I would say stiff.
Yeah, stiff. I've used globular before, globe-like, you know, if it's a very round shape to the plant, I've used that before.
Polymer?
Sure. Yep. Yep, you could use that. Really, it's just anything that's going to help you remember what the plant looked like, right? Especially if we're a nature journaler who is going out making these observations and we're not sketching what we're seeing too, and we're just going to rely on kind of the words that we're using to evoke a certain sense for us, then you can use these words that are typically used, but then you can also use words that evoke a certain meaning for yourself, right? You don't have to rely on standard botanical terminology. If you think a plant, for some reason you saw a plant and it reminded you of an armadillo, you could say, oh, this was the armadillo shaped plant. And because you had that reaction to it at the beginning, it'll help trigger that memory for you. And so writing down all those observations, even the silly things that come to your mind, are really good to maintain that kind of memory triggering. Right. And last week we talked about one of the health benefits of nature journaling is to protect memory and to kind of encourage that exercising the elasticity of our brains. And so I just wanted to kind of quickly talk about, what defines or what determines rather the form a plant takes. And there are a few things that are specific to the plant that are going to kind of determine this shape, this form that they take. And one of those is the distance between nodes. And what a node is if you look at a plant, I was wondering if I can, here, I can actually show you one. Hang on a second. I have one right here, ready to go. It's just out of reach. Okay, so I'm going to have to turn my background off. Oh, no, there you go. So when you're looking at this plant, right, you can see along the stem, the places where the leaves emerge from the stem, right? Those locations on the stem are called nodes. Those are the growth areas on the stem. And so the space in between those nodes is going to determine whether or not it has a sprawling appearance, right? The longer the distance is between nodes, especially on a very flexible plant, the more likely it is to have a sprawling or trailing or vining structure. Stem rigidity. So how rigid is that stem? Does it feel wood-like when you squeeze it, or is it hollow? Those are some things to look at. And then whether it's flowering or non-flowering will also help determine its form, its shape. Remember when we were talking about the ferns, right? They kind of require this certain airy structure to let those spores be free and be able to be dispersed by the wind. Okay, so next activity, you can head back to the Jamboard. We'll go to number 2. So if you would, just on a sticky note, go ahead and you can see the sticky notes over here on the left. Describe the form of these plants. How would you write about these plants in your nature journal? if you need the link to the Jamboard again, it's in the chat box. But I see a lot of you are still here.
Excuse me, I can't get the tools to work on the left-hand side there. Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Wait, now I don't have it. Wait a minute. Let me see.
No, that was me. I think you're trying to click on my screen here. Let me,
Oh,
I'll go away from there. You have to go to the Jamboard on your computer.
oh, I'm sorry. So that's back here. All right, wait a minute.
Sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
that's confusing. I'll
Yeah.
I'll keep it off of the screen.
I had trouble with it the last time, so let's see. Okay, there we go. Except now I don't have the picture. All right, wait a minute. Do I have to go back through the chat?
To get the link to the Jamboard here, let me, I'll put it back in there. I think that's still in
No,
there.
I've got it. It's-
Okay. Here, I'll
So-
stop my share just entirely. That way there's no confusion between my screen and what you're looking at for the Jamboard. And then we'll come back and look at it all together when you're done. How does 3 minutes sound? Think that sounds good? Thumbs up? Okay.
What in the world?
Melissa,
Yes.
because you removed me, I went through and entered as a guest, and I did it on my phone. But so I don't know if anyone's ever experienced this. When I use the link in the chat, all it does is take me to the application, to download an application. So unfortunately, I tried to re-enter through my computer several times and it says I've been removed and I'm unable to re-enter.
Okay. Okay.
So I just can't participate because it doesn't let me on my phone.
Okay. No problem. If you want to, I can put the image back up here in a second and you can just type into the chat box. If that works, Christine.
Yeah, that's fine. I can
Okay.
definitely use the chat box.
Okay. Feel free to, be creative too. You don't have to, I see somebody said trumpet shaped flower. That's great. Let me resize that. Somebody grabbed that image and made it pretty big there. Here, move it down here again. There you go. Good. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and look at some of these. So you should be seeing my screen now. If you want to come back to the Zoom, if you're not there. And, some of these things, I like this. We've got sprawling, flowering. Somebody knows what this plant is and where it is and described it as salt tolerant. Trumpet shaped flowers. It's good to kind of use those words that are going to evoke a very specific image, right? We have upright, rigid stem. You can see that there's a short distance between the nodes here. Tall flowers, sprawling flowers, leafy, sprawling. So these are all good words to use. These are two of my favorite native plants that are found here in our area in two very distinct habitats. The one on the left is Lupinus diffusus, sky blue lupine, and it blooms this time of year. It's blooming right now. And this is at Rye Preserve. And you can actually see it's really close to the road here along the Orange Trail out at Rye Preserve. So if you go out that way and you do any hikes, Lupinus diffusus is putting on a show right now. And something that you would know if you were in person is that the leaves of this plant are so soft. They are covered with all these really soft, fine, fuzzy hairs. And so you can't just look at this plant, you have to feel this plant. And this is in a scrub habitat. I'm going to talk a little bit more about habitat in a slide or two. The one on the right is, it's a beach morning glory. And it is Ipomea pescapre, and it's called pescapre because the leaves look like a goat's foot. So pescapre actually means foot of a goat, and that's because of the shape of the leaf. This is also called railroad vine for the common name, and it's found growing in our dunes ecosystems, most commonly here in our area. All right. So I'm going to give you some words to talk a little bit more specifically about leaf shape. So we know that plants can have forms, right? But the individual leaves also have forms. And you don't have to get too crazy into this from a nature journaling perspective, but it's good to kind of know that there are different words to describe different kinds of plants, and also that leaves can be simple, meaning there's one leaf. They can be compound, which means that there are leaflets within the larger leaf, and they can be compound in different ways. So here we have pinnately compound, palmately compound, and doubly compound. And so the most important takeaway here is just to know the difference between a simple leaf, which is where you have one leaf, or a compound leaf where you have many leaflets in the same leaf. Leaf shapes can come in, it's amazing the different kinds of leaf shapes that you can get. But it all kind of depends on, again, thinking about form following function and where these plants live and whether or not they want things to eat them. But all leaves will have a midrib, which is the main vein going along the center line of the leaf, which is attached to, here they call it the leaf stalk, but it's also called the petiole. So you'll have the leaf stalk or the petiole, which attaches the leaf to the stem. And then you're going to have the margin, which is the edge of the leaf. And this is what's really important for you all, is the margin, the midrib, the petiole. Being able to describe those three parts of a leaf will be really helpful, because those tend to have a lot of defining character to them. You may find some that have, some interesting different kinds of venation in them. But for the most part, looking at that midrib, is it very prominent? Is it hard to find? Is it a different color than the rest of the leaf? Those can help you with identification. The leaf stalk or petiole, the way that it attaches to the stem, I can tell that this leaf is in an opposite leaf arrangement because the petiole is attached here on the opposite side of this petiole. Okay, see how you have the stem here and then you have, I tried to click on it. You have the stem here, and then you have these two leaf stalks, and they're opposite each other. So that means that this leaf arrangement is opposite. You can also have an alternate leaf arrangement, which would mean that the leaf stalk would be attached here, and then there'd be another one maybe attached right here, and they would continue going on and around up the stem. So those are all good things to help you when you're making observations of plants to write down, so that you can maybe do some identification, or just to help you remember more accurately what the plant looked like. Leaf margins can have all kinds of different ways that they are formed. You can have crenate, incised, which means that it kind of looks like it comes in sharply, right? Looks kind of like incisors, like teeth. Sinuate, a sinuous shape, undulate, lobed, all of these. An entire leaf is one in which you can't really, it's just basically like a straight line around the margin. So there are all kinds of different ways that you can describe the margin of the leaf as well. And again, for our purposes in this class, if you want to learn how to identify plants, it's good to learn some of this terminology. But if you're just out to get a good description so that you can remember it later, or you can maybe sketch it out better or write a poem about it, you could say something like it was, I don't know, you could use some other kind of adjective rather than lobed or undulate. You could just say it was wavy, right? Instead of saying undulate, you could just say wavy. And that could mean the same thing to you, okay? But what's important to recognize again is that there are simple leaves where it's one leaf, compound leaves where there are several leaves, and that the leaf margin is the edge of the leaf, and the midrib and the leaf stalk can tell you a lot about the plant. So what about grasses? We've been talking a lot about forms of plants, and some of them are very grass-like, but they're not grasses, right? And so when we talk about, I just wanted to take this aside really quick because there are some things that kind of meet the definition of a grass and others that do not. And so for something to be a grass, it has to have parallel veins. And so when you look at these leaves here, the veins are running up and they are parallel to each other. Okay, so you're going to look for that parallel venation, and then there are other things to think about, but for our purposes for this class, look for that parallel venation. And these plants are generally going to fall into the monocot category, which means that they are they have a different way that their vascular system kind of travels throughout their body. So the way that they move water through their bodies is a little bit different than the way other types of plants do. Okay. Another Jamboard. You want to go to the third one? This one should be pretty easy. I'm going to leave it on the PowerPoint so I don't confuse anybody, but just take like a minute. Look at both images, write on a sticky note a description of the leaf shape, and then just circle or draw an arrow or something to the one that you think is a grass. And I'm not trying to trick you. It's really not. It's not a tricky one. And we're going to be quick with this one because we're pushing up towards the end of our time. Okay. And a couple responses there. That's good. All right, I lied. It's a little tricky. All right, I'm going to give you 30 more seconds. All right. So it looks like a lot of people are pointing to the one on the left. Good, good. Somebody figured it out. Very good. So the image on the left, it looks like a grass. It does have parallel veination, and its common name is bear grass, but it's actually a yucca, and so it is not technically a grass. But there is grass growing here in this image on the right-hand side. So you can see that kind of, this is probably just turf grass of some sort. Maybe it's native type St. Augustine or something like that popping up and around. And then you can see the leaf shape here. Somebody said it was simple, good, incised. Yeah, you could say that it's a, three-pointed, incised leaf with a pale mid-vein, and maybe draw a sketch of it. Right, that would be the one that you're trying to call out there. So this is good. These are all really great thoughts, and I did trick you a little bit. I'm sorry. And so I want to just quickly go over some flower anatomy. And I love this image, and I'm sure you've all heard that the earth laughs in flowers. That's a really good saying. So with flower anatomy, you probably have all seen a cross section like this at some point, but it's good to have a quick reminder, right? We have different parts of a flower. You're going to have your petals, right? This is your petal. Your sepal is going to be this kind of leaf-like structure here at the bottom. And then you have this whole structure in the middle is called the pistil. And the pistil is composed of the stigma and then the ovule in here. And then you also have the stamen right here. And the stamen is where the pollen is produced. And that is going to allow the plant to reproduce. And some plants produce fruit, some plants produce seed. Some seeds are dispersed by the wind. Some seeds are dispersed by animals. Some seeds are dispersed by water. Can you think of a good example of a seed that is dispersed by an animal? Anybody? They like
sunflower.
Sunflower could be. Yeah, birds definitely eat sunflower seeds, and they could survive and drop them somewhere. Birds are really good at giving plants a nice start by eating them and then depositing them with a nice little fertilizer packet when they land on the ground, and kind of helping spread them around. And I don't want to spend too much time on this one because we already talked about kind of phylogeny, but just remember that plants can belong to certain families and they'll have similar characteristics like asters, Asteraceae. And then the genus is going to tell you a little bit about it. So Helianthus is going to tell you that this is a sunflower. So this is a sunflower in the aster family. And this one specifically is Helianthus debilis, which is our dune sunflower, which is found here in our coastal systems. And so recognizing some of these common ways that plants are named can help you recognize some of their characteristics too. Like all sunflowers share a lot of morphological characteristics. So botanical names can be really useful. I like them a lot because once you learn them, they tell you a lot about the plant, and they can kind of give an insight too to the naming of them. Like some of them there's a bunch of plants in Florida that are named Michoxi, right? The genus is something something, and then the species is Michoxi. That's because Michaud was a botanist, and he named all these plants after himself. So there's some fun history to be had in the names of plants as well. Obviously, we've been talking about how form follows function, and different plants are going to grow in different habitats. Our beach systems are really high energy. The plants have to be really good at surviving salt spray, wind, heat, right? And then you're going to get a totally different host of plants in an ecosystem where pines predominate, right? The soil is going to be completely different. There's going to be a different amount of light there, a different type of salt tolerance. And then if you go to a wetland, the plants are going to be completely different there. So that's one of the amazing things about this process that we're in now as people who are going out and documenting our experience in nature, is that there's always going to be something new to see when we go to one of these different habitats. And one of the things that I'm hoping comes out of this class, I'm working right now with some of the folks in our preserve management group to develop a map of kind of journaling hotspots, so that you guys can go to a map and see where there are kind of neat spots within the county to go and document different types of plants or animals or what have you. So I'll keep you all in the loop on that as it is developed. We're not going to do this because we're running out of time. I'm sorry. I apparently like talking about phylogeny a lot more than I expected. But I do want to just go ahead and talk to you about next week. We're going to be talking about trees specifically next week. So we're going to spend some time on ways to describe trees, but then I'm also going to kind of highlight some of the ways that trees have been influential when we look at literature, right? Because this is a library program where we partner with our library to give this program. And I wanted to kind of bring in some more kind of literature references to our class next week. And that might spur some conversation on how we can make these different types of observations about trees, especially if we think about them in slightly different ways. So next week is talking trees, and you do have homework. All right, this is your homework. Take a 10-minute walk outside and write down 3 observations. Nothing else to it, but be prepared to share at the next class at the beginning of class. All right, so take a 10-minute walk outside and write down 3 observations. All right. And with that, I know that was probably a lot of information. I'm sorry if that was a little overwhelming. Let me know if you have any questions. Somebody has a question. Who's got a question for me?
Only question I have is, can you spell please petiole or petile, the thing that's also the leaf stalk?
Petiole, P-E-T-I-O-L-E.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. Are observations to be about trees or whatever we see?
Whatever you see.
Okay.
All right. If there's nothing else, I hope this was a good kind of crash course in plant description and plant types. And I'm looking forward to next week. As I said, this is a really great way for me to kind of round out my day on Wednesdays for the next, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. So it's really delightful. And please, in the meantime, you can feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat if you have any questions that you think about in between now and next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everybody have a great day.
You too. Thank you. Bye.